exactly 3 years after President Obama, so famously in his inaugural address, extends a hand of friendship to Iran and the Muslim world in hope that there would be an unclenched fist on the other side, we are pretty much back where we started, in which Secretary of Defense Panetta said just about a few weeks ago that he views the risk of a military confrontation to be around 50-50. So how did we go from that very hopeful moment when Obama first came into power to the moment in which Panetta felt that he needed to say or to share with the world his estimation for the risk of war? Well, there's a couple of things I think we need to take into consideration. It's important to keep in mind that part of the reason why Obama in the first place even could make the argument for diplomacy was precisely because of the American public's rejection of the Bush foreign policy and the fundamental assumption, ideological assumption that it was relying on, which was that you do not talk to your enemies because if you do, you risk legitimizing them. The track record of that policy in the case of Iran was quite clear. In the Iranian case, they probably had less than 50 centrifuges in 2000 when Bush came into power, and they had more than 8,000 by the time he left office. Iran was squeezed between a hostile regime in Afghanistan and a hostile regime in Iraq. By the time Bush left, Iran had become the kingmaker of the political order in those two countries. And it has also expanded its soft power by cleverly taking advantage of America's declining popularity in the region. That gave Obama a political opening in which he could do something that was quite unprecedented. He could go forward and make the case that we need to reconstitute diplomacy as the central tool of statecraft. An approach that under normal circumstances would have been political suicide, running on a platform of talking to the Iranians won't get you very far. But in 2008, it became a winning card precisely because of the rejection of the Bush foreign policy among the general American public. But that opening was not going to be long-lived, according to the administration's own calculations. They felt that the political space for them to be able to pursue diplomacy would not last longer than approximately 12 months. And the reasons why it would close down was because, A, the Iranians were continuing to amass low-enriched uranium. By the time they got to 1,000 to 1,200 kilograms of LEU, that would be sufficient theoretically to build a bomb. And that would increase the pressure on the administration to take military action. Moreover, there was pressure from Israel and from Saudi Arabia, states who feared that in a diplomatic solution between the United States and Iran, the United States would cut a deal that essentially would come at their expense. And there was also a lot of skepticism in some of the European capitals, particularly in France, where there was a fear that Obama would be so eager to strike a nuclear deal with the Iranians that he would sacrifice long-standing West and red lines on that issue. Among America's many close friends, many wished Obama well, but very few wished him success. And that was a reality that he had to deal with throughout this period. And of course, he ran into difficulties from the very outset because A, it took about 4 months for him to do a policy review and come up with what the actual strategy for the policy would be. So 4 out of the 12 months were gone. Then the next dilemma that they were dealing with was, should they or should they not talk to the Iranians prior to the Iranian elections in June 2012? The arguments were essentially that if they did talk, was there any certainty that the Iranians actually could negotiate while they're in the midst of their political season? And if they could, would talking to the Ahmadinejad government right before the elections give him a boost in the elections, and Obama essentially could potentially become credited for securing his re-election? So the decision was to not go forward with diplomacy until after the elections, but that also meant that 6 of the 12 months would have passed by the time they potentially could get to talks. But what the administration, of course, did not expect was that rather than having some level of political clarity on June 13th, the day after the elections, it was quite the opposite. Because you had allegations of massive fraud And of course, massive human rights abuses taking place on the streets of Tehran and other cities of Iran in front of the entire world to see. And you had a political elite that essentially became at war with itself and with society at large. Iran became paralyzed. There was no prospects for diplomacy under those circumstances because there was really no one that could talk from the other side. And that created a problem for the administration on two different levels. First, because it further cost them a lot of time. It was not clear any longer how long they may have to wait before the dust had settled, as the president said, in Iran, in which they actually could pursue talks. And secondly, the elections and the human rights abuses that followed it became the first moral dilemma for the administration. It really became a major blow to the administration's moral comfort with the idea of pursuing negotiations. It was one thing to talk about it in the abstract, theoretically. It was a different thing to actually conduct it with a government that at that same time was engaged in such visible human rights abuses.